Hello, and welcome to Nighttime Biographies. On the morning of July 4th, 1826, in a small upstairs bedroom of his farmhouse in Quincy, Massachusetts, a 90-year-old man lay dying. Outside, the town was preparing for celebrations. Exactly 50 years had passed since the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and the entire nation was planning the greatest jubilee in its short history. Parades were being organised, speeches were being written, cannons would fire, children would wave flags. But in that quiet room, John Adams, the second President of the United States, one of the last surviving signers of the Declaration, was slipping away. The room was dim despite the July sunshine. Heavy curtains filtered the light. Adams had been bedridden for days, his body finally surrendering after 9 decades of relentless use. His breathing was shallow and laboured. His skin, once ruddy with the vigour of a farmer's constitution, had taken on the translucent quality of the very old. His hands, which had signed documents that changed the world, lay still on the coverlet. Family members moved quietly around the bed. His son, John Quincy Adams, the 6th President of the United States, had rushed back from Washington but would arrive too late. Adams's granddaughter Susanna sat at his bedside. The old man had been drifting in and out of consciousness for hours, occasionally mumbling words that were difficult to understand. Around noon, witnesses reported that Adams seemed to rouse himself. His eyes opened. He appeared to be gathering his strength for something important. Then, clearly enough to be heard, he spoke his final words. "Thomas Jefferson survives." It was a statement of comfort, perhaps, or hope, or reconciliation. The two men had been friends, then bitter enemies, then friends again in their final years, exchanging letters that explored philosophy, politics, and the meaning of their shared revolutionary experience. Adams, facing death, seemed to find solace in the thought that his old friend and rival still lived. But Adams was wrong. 500 miles to the south, at Monticello in Virginia, Thomas Jefferson had died just a few hours earlier, also on July 4th, also at the age of 83, also one of the last living signers of the Declaration. Neither man knew that the other was dying on the same day, at nearly the same hour, on the precise 50th anniversary of the document that had defined both their lives. The coincidence was so extraordinary, so perfectly symbolic, that when the news spread across the nation, many people refused to believe it. It seemed impossible, a story too neat for reality. Two of the greatest founders, the principal author of the Declaration, and one of its strongest advocates, dying together on the document's jubilee. It was as if history itself had arranged a final, cosmic punctuation mark. Consider the strangeness of this moment. Here was John Adams, a man who had helped birth a nation that did not exist when he was born, dying on the very day that nations celebrated its 50th birthday. A man who had argued for independence when it seemed like madness, who had helped negotiate the peace that secured it, who had served as the nation's first vice president and second president, who had lived to see his own son become president, now departing at the exact symbolic moment when the American experiment was demonstrating its survival. And consider the arc of that life. John Adams had been born a farmer's son in a tiny village in colonial Massachusetts. He had no wealth, no connections, no particular advantages beyond a sharp mind and an iron will. Yet through sheer force of character and intellect, he had risen to the highest offices. He had helped make a revolution. He had shaped a government. He had lived long enough to see whether the experiment would work, that it had worked, that the Republic still stood after 50 years, must have been a source of profound satisfaction in those final moments. Adams had not always been popular. His presidency had ended in defeat. He had made enemies. He had been attacked, sometimes brutally, in the press. But the nation endured. The Constitution held. The peaceful transfer of power continued. As the afternoon light faded in that Quincy bedroom, John Adams drew his last breath. It was approximately 6:20 in the evening, and outside the Jubilee celebrations were reaching their crescendo. Bells were ringing. Fireworks were being prepared. The nation was celebrating 50 years of independence, unaware that in this moment it was losing one of the men who had made that independence possible. How had this happened? How had a contentious, sometimes difficult man from a family of modest means become one of the architects of American independence? What shaped the mind that would argue so passionately for revolution? What sustained the spirit through decades of service, sacrifice, and often thankless labour? To answer these questions, we must go back nearly a century, to a small farm in Massachusetts, to a world of oxen and timber, of harsh winters and harder work, to the place where John Adams's unlikely journey began. But before we continue, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It's a simple way to support this work, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also curious to know where in the world you're joining me tonight. Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And now, let us travel back to the autumn of 1735, to America that existed only as a patchwork of British colonies clinging to the Atlantic coast. Braintree, Massachusetts, 1735. The town of Braintree lay about 10 miles south of Boston, a cluster of farms carved from rocky New England soil. This was Puritan country, settled a century earlier by English immigrants seeking religious freedom and fleeing what they saw as the corruption of the Church of England. By 1735, the first generation of zealots had passed into memory, their names carved on weathered headstones in the town cemetery. But the Puritan ethic remained as strong as ever. Hard work was a virtue, perhaps the highest virtue. Education was essential, for how else could a person read the Bible and understand God's word? Church attendance was mandatory, enforced by law and social pressure. Success was evidence of God's favour, and failure suggested moral deficiency or hidden sin. The land itself was unforgiving in ways that shaped the character of everyone who lived there. New England's soil was thin and acidic, studded with stones that seemed to multiply each spring as frost heaved new rocks to the surface. Farmers spent generations digging out these stones and piling them into the walls that still mark the region, monuments to patience and back-breaking labour. The growing season was short, perhaps 120 days between the last frost of spring and the first frost of fall. A late spring or early autumn could destroy a year's work. Winters were brutal, arriving early in November and lingering late into April. Snow could fall 6 feet deep. Temperatures plunged below zero. Farm families huddled in houses built to conserve heat, with small windows and massive central chimneys. They survived on stored food and whatever livestock they could keep alive through the cold months. Every fall was a race to get crops harvested, wood chopped and stacked, food preserved, before winter arrived and made outdoor work impossible. Summers, when they finally came, brought different challenges. The same rocky soil that made ploughing so difficult also dried out quickly, requiring constant attention to crops. Hay had to be cut and dried at exactly the right moment, not too early when it was still too moist, not too late when it had lost its nutritional value. Gardens required daily weeding. Livestock needed tending. Fences needed mending. The work never stopped. A family could work from dawn to dark for decades and accumulate only modest wealth. There were no shortcuts in New England farming, no easy paths to prosperity. But they could accumulate something more valuable in this particular culture: respectability, a reputation for honest dealing, for paying debts, for meeting obligations, for contributing to the community. In a society where everyone knew everyone else, and where reputation mattered more than money, respectability was a form of wealth that could sustain a family through generations. Into this world on October 30th, 1735, John Adams was born. The date would later be adjusted when the British Empire switched from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar, making his birthday October 19th by the old system, but he always celebrated on the 30th of October. His father was also named John Adams, and he was a figure of considerable standing in Braintree despite his modest circumstances. The elder Adams was a farmer first and foremost, as nearly everyone was in that time and place, working perhaps 40 acres of rocky land that stretched from the main road down toward the marshes where salt hay grew thick in season. The land had been in the Adams family since the 1630s, accumulated piece by piece through purchase and inheritance, worked by 3 generations before John was born. But the elder John Adams was also more than a farmer, and this made all the difference in his son's life. In a town of perhaps 150 families, leadership fell to those who showed ability and willingness to serve. John Adams Sr. served as a selectman, one of the 3 to 5 men elected annually to manage town affairs. He attended countless meetings in the drafty town hall, adjudicating boundary disputes, maintaining roads, allocating the common lands, setting the tax rate. It was unpaid work that took time away from farming, but it brought respect and influence. He was a deacon in the Congregational Church, a role that carried profound moral authority in Puritan New England. As deacon, he assisted the minister in worship, helped maintain church discipline, visited the sick, and advised the church on matters of doctrine and practice. When members of the congregation faced spiritual crises or moral failings, they often turned to Deacon Adams for guidance. The position required not just piety, but wisdom and discretion. He was a militia lieutenant, responsible for organising the town's defence. New England in the 1730s still faced threats from Native American raids and from French forces to the north. Every town maintained a militia of able-bodied men who drilled periodically and kept weapons ready. As lieutenant, Adams organised these musters, maintained the town's small arsenal, and would lead Braintree's men if danger threatened. It was a role that connected him to a larger world of colonial politics and military affairs. In winter, when farm work slowed to essential chores, he made shoes. This was a common supplemental trade among New England farmers, who learned to work leather and could produce the rough, sturdy shoes that everyone needed. He had a small shop attached to the house, with lasts in various sizes, awls and needles, and the sharp smell of leather and tanning agents. The extra income from shoemaking helped the family through lean years when harvests were poor. John Adams Sr. was not wealthy by any standard. He had no servants beyond what labour his own family could provide. His house was modest, his clothes were plain, but he was respected throughout Braintree and in neighbouring towns. He owned his land free and clear, owing no man anything. He paid his debts promptly. He met his civic obligations without complaint. He embodied the yeoman farmer ideal that would later become central to American identity. Independent, self-sufficient, beholden to no man, contributing to the common good not through wealth, but through character and service. This was the model that young John would absorb simply by watching his father, a model of public service undertaken not for profit or glory, but because the community needed it done. It was a model that would shape everything John Adams became. John's mother was Susanna Boylston Adams, and she came from a family that stood slightly higher on the social ladder than the Adams line could claim. The Boylstons were an old New England family, descended from Dr. Thomas Boylston, a physician who had immigrated from England in the 1630s. They had more education and refinement than the Adamses, and they moved in slightly more elevated social circles in Boston and the surrounding towns. Susanna's relatives included merchants and professionals, people who worked with their minds rather than their hands. Susanna brought to the marriage a small inheritance, perhaps $50 or $60, a meaningful sum for a young couple starting out. More importantly, she brought determination and high expectations. She had married somewhat beneath her station by choosing a farmer, even a respected one like Deacon Adams, and she was determined that her children would rise higher. She had ambitions for them, particularly for her eldest son, ambitions that went beyond the farm and the small confines of Braintree. She was a strong-willed woman, capable and organised, with a fierce pride in her family and her Boylston lineage. She managed her household with precision, overseeing the endless tasks that kept a farming family fed, clothed and sheltered. She supervised the kitchen garden, the root cellar, the dairy work, the spinning and weaving, the soap-making and candle-dipping. She kept accounts and managed the household budget. She had opinions on everything and was not shy about expressing them. The relationship between Deacon Adams and his wife was one of partnership, as was typical in farming families where survival required both partners to work constantly and competently. But Susanna's expectations weighed heavily on the household. She wanted more for her children than a farmer's life, and she was willing to sacrifice to provide it. John was the eldest of 3 sons. His brothers Peter and Elihu would follow him by 2 and 6 years respectively. As the firstborn son in a farming family, John carried particular weight and particular expectations. He would inherit the farm when his father died, a responsibility that came with the oldest son as naturally as breathing. He would carry on the Adams name. His success or failure would determine the family's trajectory for the next generation. This was simply the way things were, accepted by everyone without question. The house where John was born still stands in Quincy, as Braintree was later renamed, preserved now as a historical site. It's a small saltbox structure, weathered and grey, built in 1681, more than 50 years before John's birth. 2 rooms downstairs, each perhaps 15 feet square, a keeping room where the family cooked, ate and gathered, and a parlour used for formal occasions. 2 rooms upstairs, low-ceilinged under the sloping roof where the children slept. A steep roof designed to shed snow. A central chimney with multiple flues, the heart of the house that provided the only heat in winter. The keeping room dominated daily life. Here stood the massive fireplace, big enough for a person to walk into, with hooks and cranes for hanging pots over the fire. The fire never went completely out from September to June, banked at night and coaxed back to life each morning, for starting a new fire with flint and steel was tedious work. The smoke-blackened bricks at the back of the fireplace bore witness to decades of cooking. On cold nights, and there were many cold nights in a New England year, the family would gather near the fireplace, the only source of warmth in the house. The children would sit on low stools doing small tasks by firelight, carding wool, shelling corn, whatever work could be done indoors. Their mother would spin flax into linen thread, the wheel humming its steady rhythm. Their father would mend tools, or read aloud from the Bible. The fire would cast dancing shadows on the walls. Beyond the small circle of warmth, the corners of the room remained cold enough to see their breath. In summer, they would swelter in rooms built to conserve warmth, not provide ventilation. The small windows, designed to minimize heat loss in winter, made the house stuffy and close in July and August. But summers passed quickly in New England. Soon enough, cold would return, and they would be grateful for those thick walls and small windows. Life in this house and on this farm was dominated by work, endless work that shaped the rhythms of the day and the seasons of the year. Farming in New England was not a seasonal occupation where you planted in spring, tended crops in summer, harvested in fall and rested in winter. It was a year-round struggle against soil, weather, and the constant threat of failure. Spring meant ploughing as soon as the ground thawed enough to break, racing to get seeds in the ground before the brief growing season slipped away. The heavy plough had to be dragged through rocky soil by a team of oxen, with someone, often a boy of 12 or 14, walking alongside, goading the animals forward. The ploughman followed behind, fighting to keep the blade at the right depth, wrestling the handles when the plough struck yet another rock. It was brutally hard work that left a man's arms aching and his back screaming by day's end. After ploughing came harrowing to break up clods, then planting, corn, rye, oats, flax for linen. Each seed went into the ground by hand, dropped into furrows and covered with soil scraped over by foot. An acre of corn required thousands of seeds, each one planted individually. The work went on day after day until every arable inch was sown. Spring also meant repairing whatever winter had damaged. Fences that frost had heaved out of position needed to be reset. Roofs where ice had worked shingles loose needed patching. Tools that had cracked in the cold needed mending. Every building and structure on the farm required constant maintenance. Summer meant endless weeding. In that rich, moist climate, weeds grew as fast as crops, and if you didn't stay ahead of them, they would choke out everything you'd planted. Someone had to move through the corn rows daily, pulling weeds by hand or chopping them with a hoe. The work was hot, monotonous, and never-ending. Haying was summer's great crisis, the moment when everything depended on getting the timing exactly right. Salt hay in the marshes had to be cut when it was mature, but before it went to seed. The hay had to be cut with scythes, raked into piles, loaded onto carts and brought to the barn. And all of this had to happen during a stretch of dry weather, because wet hay would mould and rot and be useless for winter feed. Every farming family watched the sky obsessively during haying season. A sudden thunderstorm could ruin days of work. Hay left in the field during rain would be ruined. So when good weather came, everyone worked frantically, sun up to sundown and beyond by moonlight if necessary, to get the hay in before the weather changed. Children too young to swing a scythe would rake. Women would help load carts. Everyone worked because the survival of the livestock through winter depended on having enough good hay. Fall brought the harvest, and again, timing was everything. Corn had to be cut and shocked, apples picked and stored, root vegetables dug and put into the root cellar. The first hard frost would kill anything still in the field, so there was a desperate race to get everything harvested. A farmer might work 16-hour days in September and October, knowing that every day of good weather was precious. Fall was also slaughtering time. Pigs fattened all summer had to be killed and butchered before winter. The work was bloody and difficult, requiring multiple people to hoist the carcass, scald it to loosen bristles, gut it, cut it into manageable pieces. Nothing was wasted. The meat was salted or smoked for preservation. Fat was rendered into lard. Blood was saved for blood pudding. Even the bladder was cleaned and dried to be used as a storage container. Winter, when it finally came, didn't bring rest. It brought different work. Livestock needed feeding twice daily. Water carried from the well since the troughs would freeze solid. Barns needed mucking out regularly. The manure piled outside to be spread on fields in spring. Firewood needed constant cutting, splitting and stacking, for a household might burn 20 to 30 cords of wood in a New England winter. Winter was also when farmers made and repaired tools. A farmer needed to be a carpenter, a blacksmith, a woodworker. He made his own axe handles, repaired harnesses, fashioned new tools when old ones broke. In the evenings, by firelight, he might make baskets from oak splits, repair shoes, do any of the 1,000 small tasks that kept a farm functioning. Children were not exempt from this work. In a farming family, children were economic assets, extra hands to help with the endless labour. By age 6 or 7, a boy was expected to contribute meaningful work, feeding chickens and collecting eggs, hauling water from the well, stacking firewood, bringing the cows in from pasture for milking. These were children's tasks, simple enough for young hands but essential to the farm's operation. As they grew, the work intensified. By 10 or 11, a boy might be guiding the oxen during ploughing. By 12, he might be swinging a scythe during haying. By 14, he was doing most of the same work as a grown man, though perhaps not yet with a man's strength or endurance. There was no childhood in the modern sense, no years of play and leisure. There was work, gradually increasing in difficulty as the child grew in size and capability. For girls, the work was equally demanding but different. They helped their mothers with the endless domestic tasks: cooking, cleaning, spinning, weaving, sewing, preserving food, making soap and candles, tending the kitchen garden, caring for younger siblings. A farmer's daughter worked just as hard as his son, learning the skills she would need to manage her own household when she married. This was young John Adams's world, a world of constant work, where every day brought tasks that had to be done regardless of weather or inclination. It was a world that taught endurance, perseverance, the ability to keep working even when exhausted. It was a world that left a little time for books or abstract thought, which made his father's determination to educate him all the more remarkable. But the Adams household valued education as much as labour. This was not universal in rural New England. Many farming families saw education as an impractical luxury, something that might make a boy unsuited for the hard physical work that survival demanded. But Deacon Adams, as John's father was called, believed differently. He could read and write, abilities that set him apart from many of his contemporaries. He wanted more for his son. In colonial New England, basic education began at home. Children learned their letters from parents or older siblings, using hornbooks, small wooden paddles with printed alphabets protected by thin sheets of transparent horn. They learned to read from the Bible and from the New England Primer, a grim little book filled with moral lessons and reminders of mortality. But formal schooling was also available, even in a small town like Braintree. A local dame school, run by a woman in her home, provided basic instruction for young children. For a few pence per week, children would gather in a neighbour's kitchen to practice reading, writing, and arithmetic. The quality varied wildly depending on the teacher's ability and temperament. Young John Adams attended such a school, and by all accounts, he was not initially impressed with the experience. He was a stubborn, energetic boy who preferred outdoor work to sitting still on a hard bench. He later recalled that he would rather be doing almost anything else than conjugating Latin verbs or copying moral maxims. His father had different ideas. Deacon Adams saw in his eldest son an intelligence that could be cultivated, a mind sharp enough for college, perhaps for the ministry. The congregational clergy in New England were among the most respected members of society, educated men who wielded moral authority and lived comfortable, if not lavish, lives. It was one of the few paths available for a boy of modest means to rise above his circumstances. But first, John had to get through school, and at age 10, he announced that he was done with it. The boy who hated school. John Adams' relationship with education began with outright rebellion. At age 10, he informed his father that he would not be returning to school. He hated it. The schoolmaster was boring. The lessons were tedious. He would much rather work on the farm. Deacon Adams was not a man to tolerate defiance. He asked his son what he wanted to do with his life. John replied that he wanted to be a farmer like his father. "Very well," said the elder Adams, and the next morning he took young John out to the marshes to cut thatch, one of the most miserable jobs on a New England farm. Thatch cutting meant wading into muddy tidal marshes and harvesting salt hay with a scythe. It was back-breaking work. The The mud sucked at your boots. The hay was coarse and sharp. Insects swarmed. The sun beat down or the wind cut through your clothes depending on the season. It was the kind of work that left a man exhausted and aching. Deacon Adams worked his son hard all day. When they returned home that evening, he asked John if he still preferred farming to school. The boy, according to later accounts, admitted that the marsh work was difficult. His father then explained that there was more to farming than John had imagined. Every day brought hard, physical labour. Farming meant a lifetime of this kind of work in all weather, with little reward beyond subsistence. Education, on the other hand, opened other possibilities. A Harvard degree could lead to the ministry, to law, to positions of influence and comfort. His father was willing to sacrifice to provide that education, but John had to be willing to do his part. The lesson worked, at least partially. John returned to school, though his attitude improved slowly. The problem was not his intelligence, but his motivation. He was quick-minded and capable of learning, but he needed to see the purpose in it. His father made a change that proved decisive. He arranged for John to study under a new teacher, a man named Joseph Marsh, who had recently arrived in Braintree. Marsh was different from the previous schoolmaster. He was enthusiastic about learning. He made the subjects come alive. He challenged his students rather than simply drilling them in rote memorization. Under Marsh's tutelage, John Adams discovered something unexpected. He loved learning, not the tedious copying and recitation that had characterized his earlier education, but the real engagement with ideas. He discovered that Latin, which had seemed like a pointless torment, was the key to ancient wisdom. He found that mathematics had an elegant logic. He realized that history was not just a list of dates, but a grand narrative of human achievement and folly. The transformation was remarkable. The boy who had hated school became a dedicated student. He spent hours with his books, often studying by candlelight late into the evening. His father, seeing this change, doubled down on his investment, hiring Marsh to provide additional private instruction to prepare John for the college entrance examination. The goal was Harvard College, located in Cambridge, just a few miles north of Boston. Harvard was the oldest and most prestigious institution of higher learning in the colonies, founded in 1636 to educate congregational ministers. To attend Harvard was to join an elite group. Of the roughly 100,000 people living in Massachusetts in the 1740s, only a few dozen boys each year attended Harvard. For a farmer's son from Braintree, admission would represent an extraordinary leap in social status. The entrance requirements were rigorous. A candidate had to demonstrate competence in Latin and Greek. He had to be able to translate passages from the Bible and classical authors. He had to show basic understanding of rhetoric and logic. The examination was oral, conducted by Harvard's president and faculty, a nerve-wracking experience that had turned back many applicants. In the summer of 1751, shortly before his 16th birthday, John Adams travelled to Cambridge to take the examination. He was nervous but prepared. He had spent the previous year studying intensively with Joseph Marsh, mastering the required texts. When the examiners questioned him, he answered clearly and correctly. He was admitted. The financial burden on his family was significant. Tuition, room and board at Harvard cost approximately $8 per year, a substantial sum for a farmer whose annual income might be $30 or $40. Deacon Adams would have to scrimp and save, sell extra produce, perhaps take on additional debt. But he was willing to make the sacrifice. His son would have the education he himself had never received. In August 1751, John Adams arrived at Harvard College to begin his studies. He was 15 years old, the son of a farmer, entering a world of books and ideas that would transform him utterly. Harvard and the awakening Harvard College in 1751 was a small institution by any modern standard. but it loomed large in the imagination of colonial Massachusetts. The campus consisted of a few brick buildings arranged around a yard in Cambridge: Massachusetts Hall, Stoughton Hall, Holden Chapel, and Harvard Hall, which housed the library. Perhaps 100 students were enrolled, at any given time, drawn from the families of ministers, merchants, and more prosperous farmers across New England. The students were divided into 4 classes: freshmen, sophomores, junior sophisters, and senior sophisters. They lived 2 or 3 to a room in spare chambers heated by fireplaces that left them frozen on winter mornings. They attended compulsory chapel services twice daily. They studied a curriculum focused on classical languages, rhetoric, logic, ethics, natural philosophy, what we would call science, and theology. The education was rigorous and classical. Students read Cicero and Virgil in Latin, Homer and the New Testament in Greek. They studied Aristotelian logic and practiced formal disputations, arguments structured according to strict logical rules. They learned about the physical world from texts that combined genuine observation with ancient authorities. They absorbed Calvinist theology from their required readings in divinity. For John Adams, Harvard was a revelation. He had been a good student in Braintree, but here he was surrounded by other talented young men, many of whom had received better preparation than he had. He was not at the top of his class academically, though he was far from the bottom. More importantly, he was exposed to ideas and arguments that challenged everything he'd been taught. The Harvard faculty in the 1750s were in the midst of an intellectual transition. Traditional Calvinist theology, with its emphasis on predestination and human depravity, was being questioned by Enlightenment ideas about reason, natural law, and human potential. The faculty were cautious about pushing too hard in the new directions, but attentive students like Adams could sense the tensions. Adams read widely beyond the required curriculum. He discovered the works of John Locke, whose ideas about natural rights and government by consent would later shape revolutionary thought. He read Isaac Newton and marvelled at the idea that the universe operated according to discoverable mathematical laws. He absorbed the essays of The Spectator and Tatler, which modelled a witty, polished prose style quite different from the heavy moral tone of Puritan writing. But he also experienced typical college student struggles. He was acutely aware of his social status. Many of his classmates came from wealthier families, wore better clothes, had more spending money. Harvard in that era actually ranked students by social class, listing them in the college catalogue according to their family's standing in society. Adams was ranked 14th in a class of 24, solidly middle of the social hierarchy. It was not disgraceful, but neither was it impressive. He was also wrestling with the question of what to do with his education. His father expected him to become a minister. It was the path for which Harvard was primarily designed, and it would bring honour to the Adams family. But John was developing doubts. The problem was not lack of faith. Exactly, though his reading in science and philosophy was making him question some traditional doctrines. The problem was that he didn't feel called to the ministry. He couldn't imagine standing before a congregation every Sunday, preaching sermons, providing moral guidance. The more he learned about the world, the more he wanted to engage with it on his own terms, not through the prism of theology. By his senior year, Adams had decided he would not become a minister, though he'd not yet figured out what he would become. This put him in a difficult position. He needed to tell his father that all the sacrifice and expense was not going to produce the expected result. He dreaded that conversation. But first, he had to graduate. The final exercise at Harvard was a public disputation, where seniors defended propositions against questions from the faculty and audience. Adams participated in several of these, demonstrating his skill in formal argument. On July 16, 1755, he received his bachelor's degree. He was 19 years old. Now came the question, what next? Adams had no money and no prospects. His degree made him eligible for the ministry, for teaching, or theoretically for the law. Though law was a less travelled path for Harvard graduates, he needed to find work immediately. He could not impose further financial burden on his family. A position opened in Worcester, a town about 40 miles west of Boston. A local schoolmaster was leaving, and the town needed someone to teach Latin and basic subjects to local children. The pay was modest, room and board plus perhaps $60 per year, but it would give Adams time to figure out his future. In the autumn of 1755, John Adams moved to Worcester to become a schoolmaster. He would later describe this as one of the most miserable periods of his life. The years of struggle. Worcester in 1755 was a frontier town by Massachusetts standards, rougher and less refined than the Boston area where Adams had spent his college years. It lay about 40 miles west of Boston, far enough that the journey took a full day by horseback, over roads that were little more than muddy tracks in wet weather. The town had perhaps 200 families, their farms scattered across rolling hills, connected by rough paths. The centre of town consisted of a meeting house, a few shops, a tavern, and the small school building where Adams would spend his days. The school was a modest one-room structure, draughty in winter and stifling in summer, with rough benches for students and a scarred desk for the master. Light came from small windows that were often covered with oiled paper rather than expensive glass. Heat came from a single fireplace that the students had to keep supplied with wood, which they brought from home. The smell of unwashed children, wet wool in winter, and chalk dust hung permanently in the air. Teaching was exhausting and frustrating work in ways that Adams had not anticipated. The children ranged in age from perhaps 5 years old to 15 or 16, from beginners who could barely recognise letters to older students who were preparing for college entrance examinations. He had to manage discipline for 40 or 50 children simultaneously, prepare lessons at multiple levels, and somehow provide individual instruction while keeping the entire room under control. The younger children needed constant supervision. They fidgeted, whispered, poked each other, and generally tested every limit. The older boys, some of them nearly as big as Adams himself, resented being taught by a man barely older than they were, a Harvard graduate who they suspected looked down on their farming families. They challenged his authority with subtle acts of defiance, arriving late, forgetting assignments, laughing at his corrections. Adams had to maintain order with limited tools. Corporal punishment was standard in colonial schools, and he was expected to use the rod when necessary, but he hated striking. Children found it degrading for both student and teacher. Yet without that threat, discipline collapsed. He felt trapped between his principles and practical necessity. The salary was barely enough to live on. He received perhaps $60 per year plus room and board at various homes in town, rotating among families as was customary. The money was less than he had hoped, and after paying for necessary expenses like clothing, books, and travel, he had almost nothing left. He could not afford to buy the law books he needed. He could not save toward establishing himself in a profession. He was, at age 20, treading water financially. The work offered no intellectual stimulation whatsoever. After 4 years of reading philosophy, debating ideas, and engaging with the finest minds of his generation at Harvard, Adams found himself drilling children in spelling and arithmetic. There were no colleagues to discuss ideas with. The few educated men in Worcester were busy with their own affairs. The town had no library worth the name. In his diary, which he had begun keeping at Harvard and would maintain for decades, Adams recorded his misery with painful honesty. "I have no books, no time, no friends," he wrote in one characteristic entry. I teach school, and that is all I do. I am nothing. I do nothing of consequence. The days blurred into tedious sameness. Wake at dawn in whatever farmhouse was boarding him that month, walk to the school building, teach from morning until mid-afternoon, return to his lodging exhausted, eat a simple supper with a family who viewed him as a hired hand, then fall asleep only to wake and do it all again. His social position was ambiguous and uncomfortable. As a Harvard graduate, he was educated above most townspeople, but as a poor schoolmaster dependent on their charity for housing and meals, he was also beneath them economically. He was neither gentry nor common folk, neither wealthy nor poor, caught in an uncertain middle state that left him isolated. He began to have dark thoughts about his future. Would this be his life? Teaching school in provincial towns, scraping by on meagre wages, his Harvard education wasted on drilling farm children in their ABCs? He had worked so hard, sacrificed so much, and for what? To be a village schoolmaster at age 20 with no prospects of anything better. But Worcester, for all its frustrations, also gave Adam something valuable. Time to think without distraction, and distance from his father's expectations. In the evenings, when school was done and he'd eaten his simple supper, he would retreat to whatever corner of the house his host had given him, and read by candlelight. He read whatever books he could borrow from the few educated men in town. The minister had some theology and history, a local lawyer had law books, a physician had medical texts and some science. He began to study law systematically on his own, working through whatever legal texts he could find. He started with Coke's Institutes of the Laws of England, a massive and difficult work that was the foundation of English law. The prose was dense, the concepts complex, the reasoning often circular and obscure. But Adams persisted, reading slowly, taking notes, trying to master the fundamentals. The more he read, the more convinced he became that law was his calling. Law combined everything he valued: logical reasoning, mastery of texts, practical application, and opportunities to engage with important questions about justice, rights, and social organization. Lawyers argued in public, defended principles, shaped society. They had status and income. They mattered. Law also offered a path upward that did not require family connections or inherited wealth. A talented lawyer could build a practice through ability and reputation. Unlike the ministry, which required conformity to established doctrines, law rewarded independence and originality of thought. A lawyer could take unpopular positions, defend unpopular clients, and still succeed if he was skillful enough. Adams' resolve hardened through that difficult year in Worcester. He would study law. He would leave teaching as soon as he could arrange it. He would find an attorney willing to take him as an apprentice. And he would work as hard as necessary to succeed, no matter how long it took or how many obstacles he faced. The law in colonial America was not yet the organized profession it would become. There were no law schools, no bar examinations, no formal requirements. To become a lawyer, a young man typically apprenticed himself to an established attorney, reading law in the attorney's office while helping with clerical work. After a few years, if the attorney judged the student ready, he would be admitted to practice before the local courts. Adams approached a Worcester attorney named James Putnam and asked to study law in Putnam's office. Putnam agreed, and in 1756 Adams began his legal education while continuing to teach school. He would teach during the day and study law in the evenings and on weekends. It was a grueling schedule, but Adams was driven by a growing clarity about his ambitions. He wanted more than a comfortable life. He wanted to achieve something significant. He wanted, though he was embarrassed to admit it even in his private diary, to become famous, to be remembered, to leave a mark on the world. These were not modest aspirations for a schoolmaster from Braintree, but they burned in him with increasing intensity. For 2 years, Adams studied law with Putnam while teaching school. He read Coke's Institutes, Blackstone's commentaries, and dozens of other legal texts. He learned about contracts, property, torts, and criminal law. He practiced writing legal arguments. He observed court proceedings when he could. In 1758, after 2 years of study, Adams decided he was ready to begin practicing law. He was 23 years old, and he could not afford to spend more time as a schoolmaster. James Putnam wrote him a letter of recommendation, testifying to his diligence and ability. Adams needed to be admitted to practice before the Boston courts, which required approval from the bar, the collective body of established attorneys who controlled entry to the profession. He presented himself to several prominent Boston lawyers with some trepidation. These were successful men who moved in circles far above a schoolmaster from Braintree. They had the power to refuse him admission if they judged him unqualified or unsuitable. Adams wore his best clothes, carried his letter from Putnam, and prepared himself to demonstrate his knowledge. Jeremiah Gridley was the dean of the Boston Bar, the most respected attorney in Massachusetts. He was in his 50s, wealthy, connected to the province's most powerful families. His approval was essential. Adams called at Gridley's office, a comfortable room lined with law books, and presented himself, nervously. Gridley questioned Adams closely about his legal knowledge, asking him to explain points of law, to distinguish between legal concepts, to demonstrate his understanding of court procedures. Adams answered carefully, drawing on his 2 years of intensive study. Gridley listened, occasionally nodding, his face revealing nothing. Finally, Gridley pronounced himself satisfied. Adams was qualified to practice law, but then Gridley offered advice that Adams would remember for the rest of his life. He told the young man to pursue the study of law itself, not merely the study of lawyers and cases. Too many attorneys relied on precedent and authority without understanding the principles beneath. A lawyer who understood the foundations of law, who could reason from first principles, would always have an advantage over those who merely memorized cases. Gridley also emphasized character above all else. Legal ability could carry a man only so far. Reputation for honesty, integrity, and discretion would determine long-term success. In a profession that dealt with people's property, liberty, and sometimes their lives, trust was everything. Never degrade your profession, Gridley warned, and your profession will never degrade you. In November 1758, John Adams was formally admitted to practice law in Suffolk County, which included Boston and the surrounding area. He was now a lawyer, though he had no clients, no office, and no income from legal work. He moved back to Braintree, rented space in his family's house for an office, and hung out his shingle. Then he waited for business. The waiting was agonizing and humiliating. Days passed with no clients, then weeks. Other young lawyers seemed to attract business immediately, but Adams's door remained empty. He began to wonder if he'd made a terrible mistake. Perhaps he was not suited for law after all. Perhaps people sensed something wanting in him, some deficiency that made them unwilling to trust him with their affairs. He filled the empty hours by attending every court session in the county, watching how experienced lawyers argued cases, learning procedure, making himself known to judges and other attorneys. He sat in the back of courtrooms taking notes, observing everything, how lawyers examined witnesses, how they addressed the bench, what arguments persuaded juries, what tactics failed. He also continued his studies, reading deeper into legal history and theory. He worked his way through Coke's entire corpus. Painful as it was, he read Blackstone's commentaries, which were just being published in London, and which provided the clearest explanation of English law ever written. He studied the history of English constitutional development, learning about Magna Carta, the English Civil War, the Glorious Revolution. This intensive self-education would eventually pay enormous dividends, giving Adams a deeper understanding of legal principles than most of his contemporaries possessed. But in 1759, as he sat in his makeshift office day after day with no clients, it seemed like pointless effort. The few cases that came his way in those early years were trivial and barely paid enough to cover expenses. Small debt collections, minor property disputes, writing wills for farmers. The fees were a few shillings per case, not nearly enough to live on. He was still dependent on his family, still living in his childhood home at age 24, and it was humiliating. He kept meticulous records of every case in a book he labelled Minutes of Causes. Each entry recorded the parties, the nature of the dispute, the arguments made, the outcome, and the fee received, if any. Reading through these entries from 1759 and 1760 is to witness a young lawyer struggling to establish himself, taking any case that came along, working for minimal compensation, slowly building experience. But Adams was patient, methodical, and relentless. He attended every court session. He cultivated relationships with town selectmen and church deacons who might need legal services or could refer clients. He wrote out legal precedents in careful longhand, building his own reference library since he could not afford to buy law books. He studied constantly, determined to know more than his competitors. Slowly, painfully slowly, his practice grew. By 1760, he was handling several cases a month, though still mostly small matters. By 1761, he was appearing regularly before the Superior Court, Massachusetts's highest court, arguing more substantial cases. He was building a reputation as a thorough, honest attorney who prepared his cases carefully and could be trusted to represent clients competently. The legal community was small, and word spread about talented young lawyers. Adams began to receive referrals from other attorneys who were too busy to handle every case that came their way. He developed a specialty in commercial law, representing merchants in disputes over contracts and shipping. The fees were larger, the clients more prestigious. By 1763, Adams was making a decent living from his law practice, though he was still far from wealthy. He could support himself independently of his family. He could afford to buy books and occasionally new clothes. He was no longer an impoverished schoolmaster or a struggling beginner. He was a working lawyer with a growing reputation. But he was still living in Braintree, still unmarried, still struggling financially. He was 25 years old and beginning to feel that life was passing him by. His college classmates who had entered the ministry were settled in comfortable parsonages. Those who had gone into business or inherited family enterprises were prospering. Adams was still scrambling for clients. And then two things happened that changed everything. First, his father died suddenly in 1761, leaving John a house and about 40 acres of land in Braintree. It was not a fortune, but it gave him security and a modest income from rents. Second, he met a woman named Abigail Smith. The courtship. Abigail Smith was born in Weymouth, Massachusetts in 1744, making her 9 years younger than John Adams. She was the daughter of Reverend William Smith, the congregational minister of Weymouth, and his wife, Elizabeth Quincy Smith. Through her mother, Abigail was connected to the prominent Quincy family, giving her a social standing somewhat above Adams's own background. She'd received no formal education, as was typical for girls of her era, but her father's library had been open to her, and she had educated herself by reading widely. She was fluent in English literature, knowledgeable about history, and possessed of a sharp, quick intelligence that impressed everyone who knew her. She was also, by all accounts, quite attractive, though not conventionally beautiful. She was small and slender, with dark hair and penetrating eyes. More importantly, she had a personality that combined wit, warmth, and a firmness of character that could match even Adams's strong will. John met Abigail in 1759 when he visited the Smith parsonage on legal business. He was immediately struck by her intelligence. She was not like the other young women he knew, whose conversation rarely went beyond domestic matters. Abigail had opinions on politics, literature, and philosophy. She challenged his ideas, she made him laugh. She was, he confided to his diary, extraordinary. But the courtship was not smooth. Abigail's mother had reservations about the match. Adams was a lawyer, a profession that Puritans still viewed with some suspicion, associating it with deception and greed. He had no great wealth. His family, while respectable, was not as distinguished as the Smiths and Quinceys. Mrs. Smith clearly hoped her daughter might marry better. Adams himself was hesitant. He was still building his practice, still financially insecure. He had doubts about his own worthiness. In his diary, he agonized over whether he was ready for marriage, whether he could support a wife, whether he was being presumptuous in courting a woman of higher social standing. But Abigail had no such doubts. She recognized in John a man of extraordinary ability, someone whose intelligence and ambition matched her own. She was willing to wait while he established himself. They began exchanging letters, a correspondence that would continue throughout their marriage, and would eventually become one of the great literary treasures of American history. The letters reveal two people perfectly matched in mind and temperament. They teased each other, debated ideas, shared observations, and expressed affection in language that was by turns playful and profound. Abigail signed her letters Diana, the Roman goddess of the hunt, casting herself as independent and untamed. John sometimes signed himself Lysander, a Spartan general, suggesting military valour and leadership. They were married on October 25th, 1764, when John was 28 and Abigail was 19. The ceremony was performed by Abigail's father in the Weymouth parsonage. The couple moved into the small house in Braintree that John had inherited from his father. It was a modest beginning, but it was theirs. The marriage would last 54 years, until Abigail's death in 1818. It would survive long separations, political controversies, personal tragedies, and the tremendous pressures of public life. It would produce 6 children, though 2 would not survive infancy. And it would provide John Adams with something he desperately needed: an intellectual partner, a confidant, a source of strength and wisdom. Abigail Adams was not content to be merely a supportive wife. She managed the family finances, ran the farm when John was away, educated their children, and offered political advice that John valued and often followed. She was, in every sense, his equal, and their marriage was a partnership of minds as much as of hearts. But in 1764 these accomplishments lay in the future. For now, John Adams was simply a young lawyer with a new wife, trying to build a practice and a life in Braintree, Massachusetts. He could not have imagined that within a decade he would be at the centre of a revolution. The road to revolution. The 1760s brought increasing tension between the American colonies and Great Britain. The French and Indian War had ended in 1763 with British victory, but the war had been expensive, and Parliament decided that the colonies should help pay for their own defence. A series of new taxes and regulations followed, each one stirring greater resentment in America. The Sugar Act of 1764 raised duties on imported goods. The Stamp Act of 1765 required that many printed materials carry a tax stamp, directly taxing colonists for the first time. The Townshend Acts of 1767 imposed duties on glass, paint, paper, and tea. With each new measure, colonial anger grew. Adams watched these developments with growing concern. The taxes themselves were not ruinous, but the principle behind them troubled him deeply. The colonists had no representatives in Parliament. They had not consented to these taxes. Parliament was claiming the right to tax Americans without their agreement, which violated the fundamental English constitutional principle that people could not be taxed without their consent. Adams began writing essays on these topics, publishing them anonymously in Boston newspapers. His arguments were careful and legal, drawing on English constitutional history and natural rights theory. He argued that the colonies were subject to the British Crown, but not to Parliament, which represented only the people of Great Britain. Americans had their own legislative assemblies to pass laws and levy taxes. These ideas were becoming widespread in the colonies, but Adams was articulating them with a lawyer's precision. His essays attracted attention, though he was careful to keep his authorship secret. Open criticism of Parliament could be dangerous. In 1765, Adams was asked to write resolutions for Braintree against the Stamp Act. These resolutions, adopted by the town and published, declared that the Stamp Act violated colonists' rights as English subjects. The resolutions were soon adopted by dozens of other Massachusetts towns, and Adams's reputation as a constitutional thinker began to grow. But Adams also had to make a living. His law practice was growing steadily. He was now appearing regularly in the Superior Court and was developing a specialty in commercial law. He was making enough money to support his family comfortably, though not luxuriously. Then, in 1768, the family moved from Braintree to Boston. The move was driven by practical considerations. Boston was the commercial and legal centre of Massachusetts. Most of Adams's clients were there. The courts sat there. If he wanted to advance his legal career, he needed to be in the city. They rented a house on Brattle Square, near the centre of town. Abigail was now managing a household in the city while raising 3 young children. Abigail, called Nabby, John Quincy, and Susanna, though Susanna would die in infancy in 1770. The move marked Adams's emergence from provincial lawyer to Boston attorney, a significant step up in status and income. Boston in the late 1760s was a city on edge. British troops had been stationed there to enforce the trade laws, and the presence of redcoats on the streets was a constant irritation. Tensions between soldiers and townspeople were high. Fights broke out. Insults were exchanged. Everyone sensed that something was going to break. On the evening of March 5th, 1770, it did. The Boston Massacre. The night was cold and snowy. A group of Boston men and boys had been taunting a British sentry outside the custom house. The crowd grew larger and more aggressive, throwing snowballs and chunks of ice. The sentry called for help, and Captain Thomas Preston arrived, with 8 soldiers. The crowd, now numbering perhaps 300 or 400 people, pressed closer, daring the soldiers to fire. Someone threw a club that knocked down a soldier. He got up and fired his musket. Then more shots rang out. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead or dying in the snow. The shooting, which colonists immediately called the Boston Massacre, inflamed tensions even further. The soldiers and Captain Preston were arrested and charged with murder. The trial would be a crucial test of whether law could prevail over passion, whether the accused could receive a fair trial in a city that wanted them hanged. But no Boston attorney wanted to defend them. To represent the British soldiers would be to invite the fury of the mob, to destroy one's reputation, perhaps to endanger one's family. Several lawyers were approached and refused. Then someone came to John Adams's door. The visitor was a merchant named Forrest, a British sympathiser who begged Adams to take the case. Adams later wrote that he barely hesitated before agreeing. He knew the political cost would be high, but he believed passionately in the principle that everyone deserved legal representation, even hated British soldiers. His decision shocked and angered many Bostonians. His practice suffered immediately. Clients withdrew. People who had been friendly now crossed the street to avoid him. His family faced harassment. But Adams pressed forward. The trial took place in October and November 1770. Adams argued that while the soldiers had been wrong to fire, they had been provoked beyond endurance by a dangerous mob. He famously told the jury that the law should protect even those we hate, that facts are stubborn things, and that they must decide based on evidence, not emotion. The jury acquitted Captain Preston. 6 of the 8 soldiers were also acquitted. 2 were found guilty of manslaughter rather than murder and received light sentences. It was a verdict based on law and evidence, not popular passion. Adams had defended the rule of law in the face of intense public pressure. Years later, he would write that this was one of the finest actions of his life, providing legal representation to unpopular defendants because it was right. But in 1770, it cost him dearly. His law practice collapsed. He was politically toxic. He moved his family back to Braintree, returning to the modest house where he had started. He was 35 years old, and his political prospects appeared finished. But within a year, something remarkable happened. The people of Boston began to realise what Adams had done. He had not defended British tyranny, he had defended justice itself. Slowly, his reputation began to recover. By 1771, he was being elected to local offices again. His law practice rebounded, and in 1774, when Massachusetts needed delegates to the First Continental Congress, John Adams was chosen. The Boston Massacre trial had demonstrated his integrity. It had shown that he placed principle above popularity. It had marked him as a man who could be trusted in a crisis, now that crisis was coming. The Continental Congress. In September 1764, John Adams travelled to Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. Delegates from 12 colonies had gathered to coordinate resistance to British policies, specifically the intolerable acts passed in response to the Boston Tea Party. Adams was 38 years old, a provincial lawyer from Massachusetts, about to meet the great men of America. He was nervous and excited. Philadelphia was the largest city in the colonies, more sophisticated than Boston. The other delegates included George Washington of Virginia, Patrick Henry, and dozens of men whose names Adams knew only from newspapers. The Congress met for nearly 2 months, debating how to respond to British actions. Should they petition the king? Organise a boycott of British goods? Prepare for military resistance? The debates were intense, with radicals like Adams and Samuel Adams of Massachusetts pushing for stronger measures, while conservatives from New York and Pennsylvania urged caution. Adams distinguished himself through his arguments on the floor and his work on committees. He was articulate, knowledgeable about constitutional law, and tireless in committee work. He might not have been the best orator. That prize belonged to Patrick Henry, but he was one of the sharpest legal minds in the Assembly. The Congress agreed to a Continental Association, a complete boycott of British goods. It was an economic weapon that would hurt Britain while avoiding outright military conflict. The delegates agreed to meet again in May 1775 if Britain had not addressed their grievances. Adams returned to Massachusetts convinced that war was coming. The question was not if, but when. Through the winter of 1774-1775, he watched as Massachusetts militias drilled and stockpiled weapons. The British garrison in Boston grew larger. Governor Thomas Gage received orders to suppress the rebellion. On April 19, 1775, British troops marched toward Concord to seize militia supplies. They were met at Lexington Green by armed colonists. Shots were fired. Men died. By the end of the day, the British had retreated to Boston with heavy casualties, and the war had begun. News of Lexington and Concord reached John Adams as he prepared to return to Philadelphia for the Second Continental Congress. The nature of the Congress was now entirely different. They were no longer debating grievances, they were organising a war, arguing for independence. The Second Continental Congress convened in May 1775 with an impossible task: fight a war against the world's greatest military power while still officially claiming loyalty to the British Crown. It was a contradiction that could not hold. For more than a year, the Congress tried to maintain this fiction. They organised the Continental Army and appointed George Washington as commander. They authorised privateers to attack British shipping. They issued currency to pay for the war. They conducted diplomacy with foreign powers. They did everything an independent nation would do except declare themselves independent. Adams found this intolerable. From his perspective, they were already at war. Reconciliation was impossible. Every day spent pretending loyalty to King George III was a day wasted. But many delegates, particularly from the middle colonies, were not yet ready for the final break. They hoped that somehow Parliament would back down, the king would intervene, and the colonies could remain British while gaining autonomy. Adams spent 1775 and early 1776 arguing relentlessly for independence. In Congress, in committee meetings, in private conversations, he made his case. He was not always tactful. His intensity sometimes irritated other delegates. His blunt manner made enemies, but he never wavered. His most important work was not on the floor of Congress, but in his careful political organising. He worked to build coalitions. He identified which delegates could be persuaded and which arguments would work with them. He corresponded constantly with patriot leaders in other colonies, coordinating strategy. By early 1776, momentum was shifting. Thomas Paine's Common Sense was published in January, making a passionate, widely accessible argument for independence. The pamphlet sold hundreds of thousands of copies and dramatically shifted public opinion. What had been a radical position in 1775 was becoming mainstream by spring 1776. In June, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a resolution, resolved, that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. The debate was fierce. Some colonies were still not ready. The vote was postponed, but Congress appointed a committee to draft a declaration explaining why independence was necessary. The committee included Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman. Jefferson was chosen to write the first draft. He was 33, a brilliant writer, though less experienced in politics than Adams. For days, Jefferson laboured over the document in his Philadelphia lodgings. When he showed drafts to Adams and Franklin, they made small edits, but the core remained Jefferson's work. On July 2, 1776, Congress voted for independence. 12 colonies voted yes. New York abstained but would soon join. On July 4th, Congress approved the edited Declaration of Independence. Adams played a crucial role in these final debates. When some delegates wavered, he rose to speak, delivering what Jefferson later called the most persuasive argument he had ever heard. No transcript exists, but witnesses reported that Adams argued with passion and logical force, addressing every objection, answering every doubt. When the declaration was approved, Adams wrote to Abigail that July 2nd would be celebrated by future generations as a great anniversary festival, with bonfires and bells and illuminations. He was off by 2 days, but his essential point was correct. They had just done something extraordinary. Signing the declaration was an act of treason. If the war was lost, they would hang. Adams later recalled Franklin's quip, "We must all hang together, or most assuredly we shall all hang separately." Whether Franklin actually said it or not, it captured the stakes. But declaring independence and achieving it were different things. The British Army was the most powerful military force in the world. The Continental Army was short on weapons, supplies, training and money. The war was likely to be long and brutal. And for John Adams, new responsibilities were already emerging. Congress needed diplomats to seek foreign support. France was the logical ally. They hated Britain and might be willing to help. Adams would be one of those sent to Europe to negotiate. Diplomat in Europe. In November 1787, John Adams sailed for France on a mission to secure French support for American independence. He took with him his 10-year-old son, John Quincy, believing the experience would educate the boy in ways no school could match. They left behind Abigail and the other children, beginning a separation that would last for years. The voyage was dangerous. British warships patrolled the Atlantic looking for American ships. The crossing took more than a month through winter storms. Father and son were both seasick for much of the journey. They finally landed in France in March 1778. Adams found Paris overwhelming. The city was enormous, sophisticated, and utterly foreign. He spoke almost no French. The court culture at Versailles, where he had to negotiate, was incomprehensible to a New England Puritan. The endless rituals, the flattery, the intrigue, all of it offended Adams's blunt, honest nature. He was also frustrated to discover that his mission was largely unnecessary. Benjamin Franklin was already in Paris and had successfully negotiated a treaty of alliance. Franklin was beloved by the French, who saw him as the embodiment of American simplicity and wisdom. Adams felt like a spare part. Moreover, Adams and Franklin had very different styles. Franklin was charming, diplomatic, patient with the endless social obligations of French court life. Adams was stiff, formal, impatient with what he saw as frivolous socializing. The two men clashed repeatedly, though they remained outwardly civil. Adams returned to America in 1779, frustrated and feeling he had accomplished little. But Congress almost immediately sent him back to Europe with a new mission: negotiate a peace treaty with Britain when the war ended, and in the meantime secure loans from the Dutch Republic. This second European mission lasted from 1780 to 1788, 8 long years during which Adams saw his family only briefly. He spent much of this time in the Netherlands, working to secure Dutch recognition of American independence and Dutch loans to support the war effort. The work was tedious and often humiliating. Adams had to plead for money from Dutch bankers who treated Americans as bad credit risks. He had to navigate the complex politics of the Dutch Republic. He studied Dutch and learned their ways of business. Slowly, painfully, he built relationships and earned trust. In 1782, he succeeded. The Dutch Republic recognized American independence and agreed to substantial loans. It was a major diplomatic victory, though one that received little recognition back home. While Washington was winning military glory and Franklin was charming Paris, Adams was doing the unglamorous work of securing financing. When peace negotiations with Britain finally began in 1782, Adams was one of 3 American commissioners, along with Franklin and John Jay. The negotiations were delicate. Britain was willing to grant independence but wanted to preserve as much American territory and influence as possible. The Americans had to balance demands from their French allies with their own interests. Adams proved to be a tough negotiator. He insisted on British recognition of American fishing rights off Newfoundland, crucial for New England's economy. He demanded that Britain evacuate all its forts on American territory. He resisted French attempts to limit American territorial claims west of the Appalachians. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, was remarkably favourable to America. The new nation gained not just independence but vast western territories. The British agreed to generous terms partly because they hoped to create a strong America that would be independent of France. Adams had played a crucial role in these negotiations, though Franklin received more public credit. The pattern was becoming clear. Adams did hard, essential work that was often overlooked or attributed to others. It was a source of growing frustration. Vice President. In 1788, after 8 years in Europe, John Adams finally returned home. He was 53 years old, exhausted, and eager to retire to his farm in Quincy. He had served his country for 14 years, sacrificing his health, his fortune, and his family life. Surely he had done enough. But the new Constitution had just been ratified, and the first presidential election was being held. George Washington would obviously be president. But who would be vice president? The Constitution specified that whoever finished second in the electoral vote count would hold that office. Adams received the second most votes and became the first vice president of the United States. It was an honour, but also a role with no clear purpose. The Constitution gave the vice president only one duty: to preside over the Senate and cast a tie-breaking vote when necessary. Adams found the position frustrating. He was not part of the cabinet. He had little influence on policy. He spent most of his time sitting in silence while the Senate debated. He described the vice presidency as the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived. Yet he took his role seriously. He cast 29 tie-breaking votes, more than any vice president before or since. He tried to establish Senate procedures and decorum. He worked to maintain neutrality in the growing political divisions between Federalists and Republicans. Those divisions were widening rapidly. Alexander Hamilton's financial policies, favouring commerce and manufacturing, had created the Federalist Party. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison's opposition had created the Republican Party. Adams tried to remain above these partisan fights, but his sympathies were clearly with the Federalists. He served as vice president for 8 years from 1789 to 1797. They were not happy years. He and Abigail spent much of the time apart, as he was required to be in the capital, while she preferred to remain in Quincy. He was often lonely and felt his contributions were unappreciated when Washington announced he would not seek a third term in 1796. Adams became the Federalist candidate for president. Thomas Jefferson became the Republican candidate. The election was bitter and close. Adams won by just 3 electoral votes. Jefferson, as runner-up, became vice president, creating the awkward situation of having the president and vice president from opposing parties. On March 4th, 1797, John Adams was inaugurated as the second President of the United States. He was 61 years old. He had spent his entire adult life in public service. Now he held the highest office in the land. It should have been a moment of triumph. Instead, it marked the beginning of the most difficult 4 years of his life. The presidency. Adams' presidency was dominated from its first day to its last by a single crisis, an undeclared naval war with France that threatened to escalate into full-scale conflict and destroy the young republic. The crisis had been building for years, and it would test every aspect of Adams's character and judgment. The background was complex and bitter. France had been America's ally during the Revolution, providing military support, loans, and diplomatic recognition when they were desperately needed. The Treaty of Alliance, signed in 1778, created obligations that some Americans believed were perpetual. But the French Revolution, which began in 1789, changed everything. The French Revolution started with ideals that many Americans supported: liberty, equality, popular sovereignty. Thomas Jefferson and other Republicans saw it as an extension of America's own revolution, proof that the principles of 1776 were spreading. But the revolution soon descended into terror with mass executions, religious persecution, and eventually war with most of Europe. By 1793, revolutionary France was at war with Britain, and the question of American policy divided the country bitterly. Many Americans, particularly Republicans, wanted to support France under the terms of the 1778 treaty. Others, particularly Federalists, thought the treaty no longer applied since the government that signed it had been overthrown. Moreover, they argued, America could not survive a war with Britain. Washington had issued a proclamation of neutrality in 1793, keeping America out of the European war. But France was furious at what they saw as American betrayal. The French began seizing American merchant ships in the Caribbean, claiming that any American vessel trading with Britain was subject to capture. By 1796, hundreds of American ships had been seized, their cargoes confiscated, their crews imprisoned. When Adams took office in March 1797, the situation was approaching a crisis point. French seizures were increasing. American merchants were demanding protection. The French government, now controlled by a five-man directory, had refused to receive Charles Cotesworth Pinckney as the American minister, effectively breaking diplomatic relations. Adams faced impossible pressures from every direction. His own Federalist Party was split between moderates who wanted peace and warhawks, who saw conflict with France as inevitable and perhaps desirable. Alexander Hamilton, though holding no office, controlled the Federalist Party machinery and commanded the loyalty of most Federalist congressmen. Hamilton wanted war. He dreamed of raising a large standing army that he could command, perhaps eventually using it to conquer Spanish Florida and Louisiana, maybe even marching south to liberate Spanish South America. The Republican opposition, led by Thomas Jefferson, who was now Adams's vice president due to the electoral system at the time, and James Madison, opposed any confrontation with France. They blamed British influence for the crisis and argued that accommodation with France was both possible and morally required. They suspected with some justification that Federalists wanted war as a pretext for building up military power that could be used to suppress domestic opposition. Adams himself wanted to avoid war at all costs. He believed correctly that America was too weak militarily and too divided politically to fight France successfully. But he also knew he had to take a strong stance or appear weak before foreign powers and domestic critics. He decided to try one more diplomatic initiative while simultaneously preparing for war. In May 1797, he appointed a three-man commission to negotiate with France: Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, who was already in Europe, John Marshall, a Virginia Federalist, and Elbridge Gerry, a Massachusetts Republican included for political balance. The commissioners were instructed to seek an end to French seizures of American ships and restoration of normal diplomatic relations. The mission was a disaster that became known as the XYZ Affair. When the American commissioners arrived in Paris in October 1797, they were not received by the French Foreign Minister Talleyrand. Instead, they were approached by three French agents, later identified in American dispatches as X, Y, and Z, who demanded bribes before negotiations could even begin. The agents wanted $250,000 for Talleyrand personally, and a loan of $12 million to the French government. The Americans were outraged. Pinckney reportedly responded with the phrase that became famous, "No, no, not a sixpence." When news of the attempted extortion reached America in early 1798, it caused a sensation. The insult to American honor was unbearable. The country erupted in war fever. Millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute became a popular slogan. Young men volunteered for military service. Congress authorized the creation of a provisional army and a navy department. Taxes were raised to fund military preparations. War seemed inevitable and even desirable to many Americans who saw France as having betrayed Republican ideals. Adams faced intense pressure to ask Congress for a declaration of war. His own cabinet, members, particularly Secretary of State Timothy Pickering and Secretary of War James McHenry, were secretly consulting with Hamilton and urging war. Public opinion was inflamed. Even moderate Federalists thought war was necessary to defend American honor. But Adams resisted. He authorized defensive measures. Naval vessels were commissioned to protect American shipping, and an undeclared naval war began in which American and French ships fought each other in the Caribbean. He signed legislation creating the Department of the Navy and authorizing the construction of frigates. He accepted the appointment of George Washington as commander of a provisional army, though Washington insisted that Hamilton be his second in command, much to Adams's disgust. But he would not ask for a declaration of war. He believed that France did not actually want war with America, and that the Directory's belligerence was partly bluster, designed to extract concessions. He also suspected correctly that Hamilton wanted war for his own purposes, to build up his political power and military glory. Adams would not give Hamilton that satisfaction. This refusal to seek a declaration of war infuriated the warhawks in his own party. They began to see Adams as weak, indecisive, too moderate. But Adams had learned something important from the XYZ dispatches. Two of the French agents had hinted that France might be willing to negotiate seriously if approached again. Adams filed this information away and waited. In this superheated atmosphere of 1798, with war fever at its peak and partisan tensions higher than at any time since the Revolution, Congress passed a series of laws that Adams would later regret signing, the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien Acts extended the residency requirement for citizenship from 5 to 14 years and gave the president power to deport any alien considered dangerous. These measures were aimed at French and Irish immigrants who tended to support Republican candidates. The Sedition Act made it a crime to publish false, scandalous and malicious writing against the government or president, punishable by fines up to $2,000 and imprisonment up to 2 years. The Federalist majority in Congress argued that these laws were necessary wartime measures to protect against French spies and internal subversion. They pointed to the quasi-war as justification, claiming that domestic security required limiting immigration and controlling seditious speech. Adams signed the bills into law in June and July 1798, believing they were temporary measures needed during a national security crisis. He later called this one of the greatest mistakes of his presidency, but at the time, with war seemingly imminent and fears of French agents infiltrating America, the laws seemed justified to many Federalists. The Sedition Act was primarily enforced against Republican newspaper editors who criticized the Adams administration. About 25 people were arrested and 10 were convicted and imprisoned. Matthew Lyon, a Republican congressman from Vermont, was convicted for criticizing Adams in a newspaper article and spent 4 months in jail. James Callender, a Scottish immigrant who wrote pamphlets attacking Federalist policies, was convicted and fined. The prosecutions were deeply unpopular, seen by many as violations of the First Amendment's protections for freedom of speech and press. Republicans were outraged, and even many Federalists thought the enforcement had gone too far. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison drafted the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, secret documents that argued states could nullify unconstitutional federal laws. These resolutions raised profound questions about federal power and state sovereignty that would not be fully resolved until the Civil War. Adams himself was uncomfortable with the Sedition Act prosecutions, though he defended the laws publicly. He understood that suppressing political criticism was dangerous in a republic, but he also felt besieged by Republican attacks that he considered unfair and even treasonous. Republican newspapers called him a monarchist, a warmonger, even published rumours about his mental health and physical appearance. The attacks were vicious and personal in ways that wounded Adams deeply. Through all of this, Adams was also dealing with profound dysfunction in his own cabinet. His Secretary of State, Timothy Pickering, was more loyal to Hamilton than to Adams. His Secretary of War, James McHenry, was Hamilton's creature and regularly consulted Hamilton before executing Adams' orders. His Secretary of the Treasury, Oliver Wolcott, also took direction from Hamilton. Only Attorney General Charles Lee was fully loyal to the president. Adams initially did not realize the extent of this disloyalty. He had inherited these cabinet members from Washington's administration and assumed they would serve him faithfully. But they were part of Hamilton's political network, and Hamilton was working actively to undermine Adams's presidency, hoping to control policy through his proxies in the cabinet. The situation was intolerable and unprecedented. The President of the United States could not trust his own cabinet. His orders were being discussed with a private citizen before being implemented. His confidential deliberations were being reported to his political rival. It was a constitutional crisis playing out behind closed doors. Meanwhile, the quasi-war with France continued through 1798 and into 1799. American naval vessels fought French ships in the Caribbean and captured dozens of French privateers. The new frigates, Constellation and Constitution, fought successful engagements against French warships. American commerce raiding damaged French interests. But neither side declared war, and the conflict remained limited to naval actions. Adams continued to watch the situation in France carefully. In 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte seized power in a coup, overthrowing the Directory and establishing himself as first consul. Napoleon was a military dictator, but he was also a pragmatist more interested in consolidating his European power than fighting a pointless war with America. Adams seized the opportunity. In February 1799, without consulting his cabinet or the Federalist leadership in Congress, he nominated William Vans Murray as Minister Plenipotentiary to France, announcing his intention to seek a negotiated peace. The announcement shocked everyone. Federalist warhawks were furious. Hamilton was apoplectic. Adams's own cabinet tried to talk him out of it. But Adams was determined. He had concluded that peace was possible and that continuing the quasi-war served only Hamilton's interests, not America's. He would seek peace even if it destroyed his political career. It was the most courageous decision of his presidency. Under pressure from Federalists, Adams agreed to send a 3-man commission rather than a single minister. He appointed Oliver Ellsworth, William Davy, and William Vans Murray. The commission sailed for France in late 1799 and negotiated through most of 1800. The resulting Convention of 1800, signed in September, ended the quasi-war and resolved most outstanding issues between the two nations. But the political damage to Adams was catastrophic. The Federalist Party split openly between Adams supporters and Hamilton supporters. Hamilton wrote a pamphlet attacking Adams's character and judgment, which he intended for private circulation among Federalist leaders, but which was leaked and published. The pamphlet damaged both men, but particularly hurt Adams' re-election chances. The presidential election of 1800 took place against this backdrop of Federalist civil war. Adams faced Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr on the Republican ticket. The campaign was vicious. Republican newspapers called Adams a monarchist who wanted to crown himself king. Federalist papers called Jefferson an atheist, coward, and a tool of France. Adams lost. Jefferson and Burr tied in the electoral vote, throwing the election into the House of Representatives, where Jefferson was eventually chosen. The Federalist Party was repudiated. Adams had served one term and would not get a second. On the morning of March 4th, 1801, John Adams left Washington before dawn, refusing to attend Jefferson's inauguration. He climbed into a coach and began the long journey back to Quincy. He was 65 years old, bitter, exhausted, and convinced he was a failure. He could not have been more wrong. History would judge him far more kindly than his contemporaries did. The retirement. For the next 25 years, John Adams lived in quiet retirement in Quincy, Massachusetts. He called his house Peacefield, and it was the first real peace he had known in decades. No more public obligations, no more political battles, no more separations from Abigail. Just books, correspondence, walks in his fields, and time with family. At first, retirement was difficult. Adams was hurt by his political defeat and sensitive to criticisms that appeared in newspapers. He read everything written about him and composed long, often bitter responses that Abigail wisely convinced him not to send. He was a man of intense pride, and the rejection stung. But gradually he found contentment. He read voraciously. History, philosophy, theology, anything he could get his hands on. He had always been a reader, but now he had time to indulge the habit fully. His library grew to thousands of volumes, many covered with his marginal notes and commentaries. He carried on extensive correspondences with old friends and former political enemies. The most remarkable of these was his reconciliation with Thomas Jefferson. The two men had not spoken since Adams left office in 1801. Their political differences had destroyed their friendship. They had been on opposite sides of every major political fight of the era. But in 1812, through the mediation of mutual friend Benjamin Rush, they began writing to each other again. The first letters were cautious, testing whether the old friendship could be revived. Adams wrote first, a brief note that was carefully neutral. Jefferson responded warmly. Once they started, they couldn't stop. For the next 14 years, they exchanged over 150 letters, discussing everything from ancient history to modern politics, from philosophy to religion to their memories of the Revolution. The correspondence is one of the great literary and intellectual treasures of American history. They disagreed about much. Adams believed in a strong central government. Jefferson favoured states' rights. Adams was sceptical of democracy. Jefferson idealised it. Adams was a religious believer. Jefferson was a sceptical deist. But the letters were not debates. They were conversations between two old men who had lived through extraordinary times together and who recognised in each other kindred spirits. Adams's daily routine in retirement was simple. He rose early, read until breakfast, then walked his farm checking on crops and repairs. He returned to his library for more reading and writing. He dined with family in mid-afternoon. He spent evenings in conversation with Abigail and visiting family members. He went to bed early. Abigail remained his closest companion and advisor. She managed the farm's finances, maintained their extensive correspondence, and provided the emotional anchor that Adams desperately needed. After a lifetime of partnership, they were finally together all the time. Their children were a source of both pride and sorrow. Their son, John Quincy, had followed his father into public service, serving as a diplomat, senator, and in 1817, becoming Secretary of State under President Monroe. Adams was intensely proud but also worried about the toll public service would take on his son. Their other surviving son, Charles, had struggled with alcoholism and died in 1800 at age 30, devastating both parents. Their daughter Nabby had married and moved away but died of breast cancer in 1813. Their son Thomas Boylston became a lawyer but never achieved the prominence of his father or brother. These family tragedies marked Adams's later years, but there were also profound satisfactions. Adams lived to see his son, John Quincy, elected as the 6th President of the United States in 1824. To have both father and son serve as president was an extraordinary achievement. Adams was immensely proud, though he warned John Quincy about the thankless nature of the office. As Adams aged, he became a kind of living monument. Visitors came to Quincy to meet the last surviving signer of the Declaration of Independence still active in public memory. They found a small, round man with wispy white hair, nearly bald, his body thickened by age but his mind still sharp. He talked constantly, telling stories of the Revolution, offering opinions on current events, arguing with anyone who would engage him. He remained intellectually vigorous into his late 80s. He read newspapers daily and kept up with political developments. He wrote letters until his hands were too shaky to hold a pen. He argued theology with visiting ministers. He was as opinionated and outspoken at 85 as he had been at 25. But inevitably the body failed. By his late 80s, Adams was mostly confined to his house. His eyesight was poor. His hearing was nearly gone. Walking became difficult. He spent most of his time in a chair by the window, reading when he could, dozing when he couldn't. Abigail died in 1818 at age 73, a devastating loss after 54 years of marriage. Adams was heartbroken. He'd relied on her for everything: companionship, advice, emotional support. Without her, he was diminished. He wrote to Jefferson that the world had lost its flavour, but Adams endured. For 8 more years he continued his quiet existence in Quincy, cared for by family members, visited by admirers, slowly fading but never losing his essential character. He remained passionate about ideas until the very end. As the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence approached in 1826, the nation prepared for enormous celebrations. Everyone understood the symbolic importance of the date. The revolutionary generation was nearly gone. This might be the last major anniversary when any of the founders were still alive. Adams received an invitation to attend celebrations in Quincy on July 4th. He declined. He was too weak to leave his house. But he dictated a toast to be read at the celebration: Independence Forever. When asked if he wished to add anything, he replied, "Not a word." On the morning of July 4th, 1826, John Adams woke in his bedroom for the last time. The final day. The day began like the previous few had, with Adams in his bed, weak but conscious. His family had been maintaining a vigil, knowing the end was close. His son Thomas Boylston was there, as was his granddaughter Susanna. They had been reading to him and moistening his lips when he seemed uncomfortable. Outside, Quincy was preparing for the Jubilee celebration. Bells would ring. Speeches would be delivered. The town would honour the 50th anniversary of independence and honour their most famous resident, still living in their midst. But inside the house, the atmosphere was quiet and solemn. Adams drifted in and out of consciousness through the morning. When he was awake, he seemed aware of what day it was. Several times he murmured words that those at his bedside struggled to hear clearly. Around midday, he seemed to rally slightly. He opened his eyes and appeared to be trying to speak. His family leaned close. "Thomas Jefferson survives," they heard him say, or something very close to those words. The syllables were unclear, the voice weak, but the meaning seemed evident. It was his last complete statement. He was thinking of his old friend and rival, taking comfort in the belief that Jefferson was still alive somewhere in Virginia, still reading, still writing, still carrying forward the work they had begun together 50 years before. But Adams was mistaken. At Monticello, Thomas Jefferson had died earlier that same day, around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Neither man knew the other was dying. Neither knew they were departing together, on the very anniversary of the document that had defined both their lives. Through the afternoon, Adams's breathing became increasingly laboured. He was no longer conscious. His family kept their vigil, watching a life ebb away. Outside, the celebration continued, with people gathering in the town square, unaware that Adams was dying. At approximately 6:20 in the evening, John Adams drew his last breath and was still. He died in the same house where he had been born 90 years and 9 months before, having travelled a path that took him from a small farm in Massachusetts to the highest offices of the nation and back again. The news spread quickly through Quincy, and the celebrations took on a different character. The Jubilee became a memorial. People gathered not just to celebrate independence, but to mourn the passing of one of its architects. When word reached other cities that Adams had died on July 4th, there was astonishment. When the further news came that Jefferson had also died on July 4th the same day, the astonishment turned to awe. It seemed impossible. It seemed like a sign, a benediction, a symbol too perfect to be mere coincidence. Newspapers across the country published accounts of the double death, marvelling at the timing. Ministers preached sermons calling it providential. Poets wrote verses about it. People saw in it evidence of divine favour on the American experiment. If God had arranged for the two greatest founders to depart together on the Jubilee of Independence, surely the nation was blessed. The funeral. John Adams's funeral was held on July 7, 1826 in Quincy. The town turned out in force. Delegations came from Boston and surrounding communities. Though Adams had been retired for 25 years, people still remembered his service and wanted to pay respects. The funeral procession moved from the Adams house to the Congregational Church where Adams had worshipped for most of his life. His coffin was carried by local men, followed by family, friends, and townspeople. Church bells tolled. Flags flew at half-mast. Inside the church, the service was simple and solemn. Reverend Peter Whitney delivered the eulogy, speaking of Adams' revolutionary service, his presidency, and his long retirement. He mentioned the extraordinary coincidence of dying on July 4th alongside Thomas Jefferson, calling it a remarkable providence. Adams was buried in the church cemetery, in the Adams family plot. The grave was marked with a simple stone, as Adams had requested. He had always disliked elaborate monuments and pretension. Even in death he wanted simplicity. Across the country, memorial services were held as news of the death spread. In Washington, Congress suspended business for a day of mourning. President John Quincy Adams, grieving the loss of his father, attended a memorial service at the Capitol. The eulogies poured in. Former presidents, congressmen, judges all offered their tributes. They praised Adams's revolutionary service, his diplomatic achievements, his integrity. Some mentioned the controversies of his presidency, particularly the Alien and Sedition Acts, but most focused on his contributions to independence and the early republic. Daniel Webster delivered one of the most famous eulogies in Faneuil Hall in Boston. He spoke of Adams and Jefferson dying together, imagining their spirits ascending together, meeting the spirits of other departed founders. It was flowery rhetoric typical of the era, but it captured the public mood. The fact that Adams and Jefferson died together on July 4th on the 50th anniversary became central to how Americans understood the revolutionary generation. It was seen as the end of an era, the final curtain on the founding drama. The last major actors were leaving the stage. For John Quincy Adams, the loss was personal and profound. He had lost not just a father, but a mentor, a guide, a connection to the revolutionary generation. He would serve as president for 4 more years, then serve in Congress for another 17 years, always carrying the weight of his father's legacy. The legacy of John Adams. John Adams has been dead for nearly 200 years, yet his influence remains woven into the fabric of American government and political thought. His legacy is complex, sometimes contradictory, but undeniably profound. His most lasting contribution was as a theorist of Republican government. Before the Revolution, Adams had written extensively about the history of republics and the structures needed to prevent tyranny while maintaining order. His thoughts on government, written in 1776, influenced the state constitutions that were being drafted across America. His ideas about separating powers between executive, legislative, and judicial branches became central to constitutional design. His work on the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, which he primarily drafted, created a template that influenced the US Constitution. It included a strong executive, an independent judiciary, and a bicameral legislature. It included a Bill of Rights. It established the principle that government existed to serve the common good, not private interests. That constitution remains in effect today, the oldest functioning written constitution in the world. Adams's defense of the constitutions of government of the United States of America, a massive work published in 1787, analysed historical governments and argued for balanced constitutional structures. It was ponderous and difficult to read, but it shaped how Americans thought about government design. The founders were building something new, but they were learning from historical examples, and Adams was their guide through that history. His diplomatic achievements are sometimes overlooked, but were crucial. His work in the Netherlands securing loans and recognition helped finance the revolution. His tough negotiating in Paris helped secure the Treaty of Paris with its generous terms for American territory and fishing rights. His later work negotiating with Britain over remaining disputes helped establish American sovereignty in practice, not just in theory. As president, his record is more complicated. The Alien and Sedition Acts were a stain on his presidency and on American history. They represented a failure to uphold the principles of free speech and press that Adams had fought for during the Revolution. He later expressed regret for signing them, but the damage was done. Yet his decision to seek peace with France in 1799-1800, despite intense political pressure for war, showed remarkable courage. It cost him re-election, split his party, and made him enemies. But it kept America out of a war it was not ready to fight. Adams considered it the most important decision of his presidency. History has validated that judgment. His participation in the peaceful transfer of power from Federalists to Republicans in 1801, despite the bitter partisan divisions, established a crucial precedent. In most countries at that time, such a political transition would have involved violence, perhaps civil war. In America, it happened peacefully because leaders like Adams, however reluctantly, accepted the will of the voters. His correspondence with Thomas Jefferson in their final years left a treasure trove of American thought. The letters covered everything from political theory to religion to reflections on their shared revolutionary experience. They reveal two brilliant minds grappling with the great questions of their time. They also reveal a genuine friendship that transcended political differences, offering a model for how Americans might disagree without being enemies. Adams' advocacy for education, for rule of law, for civic virtue, for honest government. These themes run through his entire life. He believed passionately that a republic required educated citizens who understood their civic responsibilities. He believed that law should constrain power, that even presidents were subject to legal limits. He believed that public officials should serve the common good, not their own interests. His defense of the British soldiers after the Boston Massacre stands as one of the great examples of legal integrity in American history. It would have been easy to let the mob have its way, to let passion override justice. Adams refused. He insisted that even hated enemies deserved legal representation, that courts should decide based on evidence, not popular opinion. He paid a political price, but established a principle that remains central to American justice. His family legacy is also remarkable. His son, John Quincy Adams, became president, served in Congress for 17 years after his presidency, and became one of the great advocates for abolition and Native American rights. His grandson Charles Francis Adams served as ambassador to Britain during the Civil War, helping keep Britain neutral. The Adams family remained prominent in American public life for generations, but perhaps Adams' most important legacy is simply as an example of principled public service. He spent his entire adult life in service to the country, often at great personal cost. He sacrificed his law practice, his fortune, his time with family, his health. He took on difficult, thankless tasks because he believed they needed to be done. He was not always right. He was not always wise. He could be vain, petty, and vindictive. He held grudges. He was sensitive to criticism. He sometimes let his ego override his judgment. He was, in other words, human. But he was also brilliant, honest, hard-working, and deeply principled. He cared passionately about ideas and about the Republican experiment in which he had played such a crucial role. He helped create institutions and precedents that have endured for more than 2 centuries. Adams once wrote in his diary that he wanted to leave the world better than he found it. By any measure, he succeeded. The nation he helped birth has survived and grown. The Constitution he helped shape has endured. The principles he fought for, liberty, law, and republican government, remain central to American identity. In the end, John Adams's life was one of extraordinary achievement built on a foundation of ordinary origins. He was proof that in America, or at least in the idea of America, a farmer's son could help shape history through intelligence, integrity, and relentless dedication to public service. The manner of his death, departing on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, alongside Thomas Jefferson, seemed almost staged in its symbolic perfection. It was as if history itself was writing the conclusion to a revolutionary epic, closing the book on the founding generation with a gesture too elegant to have been mere coincidence. And perhaps it was not coincidence. Perhaps 2 old men, having lived through the same revolution, having fought the same battles, having built the same nation despite their differences, were in some way connected in life and in death. Perhaps the bond they had forged in Philadelphia in 1776 was stronger than they realized, strong enough to call them from the world together on the very day their shared creation turned 50 years old. Thank you for joining me tonight on this journey through the life of John Adams, the farmer's son who helped birth a nation, the difficult man who never stopped fighting for principles he believed in, the second president who is often overlooked but whose contributions were essential. If you enjoyed this biography, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Where are you watching from tonight? What struck you most about John Adams' story? Until our next journey into history, I wish you a peaceful night. Good night. Good.